Well, welcome to the fourth talk on world history, which is about evolutional design. And in all fairness, I'm not sure there's really an argument to be made here. Because when I look at the evidence for design, I think it's overwhelming. And I don't think it really should ever have been rejected when it was in the 1850s when Darwin's theory of evolution came along. The original argument for design, well, not the original, but the reformulation of it was by Paley around about 1800, where he said, if I was to see a watch in a desert, I would conclude that the watch had a designer. And then he went on to observe that when I see all that I see in terms of biology, it leads me to believe there's a designer. Now, I would argue you could even do this particular analogy as if I saw a watch in a garden, I might be impressed by the watch and say there must be a designer for the watch. But were I to look closely at the grass on which the watch is lying, I would observe there's even more design going on in the grass than it is in the watch. And really, I think it's the lack of knowledge of what was really going on in biological systems that allowed Darwin to get away with what he did. It's Michael Behe in his book, Darwin's Black Box, that observed that inside that, what was apparently a black box in Darwin's day, the cell, was a world of complexity, such as a universe almost of complexity. Now, when I look at the issue of evolution, and I consider the scales as the balance of probabilities for evolution and against evolution, I'm very hard-pressed to think of anything that actually belongs on the evolutionary side of the scales. There are some issues like homology that are ambiguous. They could be on both sides. Likewise, natural selection works equally well for creation as for evolution. But there are a lot of arguments against evolution, and I put them down here. And I think possibly the biggest one, obviously, is the concept of irreducible complexity. That is, that their things are just too complex to come about by chance. Now, it takes, I think, engineers to see that clearly. And in this country, Britain, we have three engineers. Stuart Burgess and Anthony McIntosh produced this book in which they illustrate 20 or 30 different areas in which there is clear example of design of a phenomenal scale and irreducible complexity. But the other professor I know is very much involved in this area is also Professor Steve Taylor from Liverpool. And all three professors are in the engineering department, and I think engineers are the people best qualified to see and clearly see where there is design. Other areas where one can see this happening is in the areas of the fact there is no junk DNA. When we look into the DNA system, where there's an expectation that much of the DNA was not functional, but evolutionary baggage. In fact, since the ENCODE project has been publishing its results in the last 15 years, it's clear that there is incredible use being made throughout the whole DNA, coding, triggering, and sort of enabling things to happen. There's no real evidence of any transitional fossils. They're essentially just those stories. What's really clear is that whatever fossils we find are fully sophisticated animals or fully sophisticated plants. I'm going to look at the other ones in a bit, but the issue of the origins of the first cell, this is what led Professor Anthony Flew to change his mind from originally being a person who argued against design to arguing that there is in fact an argument for design. The sheer complexity of that cell, which we talked about as being the black box. And just recently, I came across a book called Bone of Contention by Sylvia Baker. She originally wrote this booklet in 1976, I think, and this has just been republished, I think, last year or two. And in it, she talks about a whole new branch of science called epigenetics, which deals with how a cell knows it's a nerve cell or an eye cell, and how it knows how to operate in the body. And there's a whole realm of detailed genetics going on here. And I think are only beginning to scratch the surface of what's required for life to exist. And to say that that came about by chance is, I would say, ridiculous. It would be almost like the emperor's new clothes. And I don't normally get so emphatic about something, but I think this is one of those arguments where really, if you allowed yourself to see the evidence for what it is, it would be clear as day. This is designed, not just designed, it is brilliantly designed. And every year confirms the brilliance of the design. But there's something else going on with this design, and it's what we call genetic entropy. And John Sanford, Cornell professor, one of the co-inventors of the gene gun, a very senior geneticist, came to the conclusion that evolution was false, having been for 30 years convinced it was true. And now, having seen that it's false, he sees it's clearly false, and the evidence I've just given is what he would agree with. But he also observed something else, that not only is it impossible for this to come about by chance, but actually time is not a friend of evolution. Time is an enemy of evolution, because time allows mutations to accumulate. Those mutations will destroy the genetic structure of any living being. And this, he said, was an idea that he put forward in, I think, about 2005 in his book, Genetic Entropy. He's published papers since then. And in a more recent edition, around about 2014, in the appendixes, he observes that actually there's been a deafening silence from the community of scientists who would be able to qualify to judge his arguments. And he says it's the first time in his scientific life he's met this silence. Always, if he's come across or put forward a controversial idea, there's been people to argue against him. And he asked someone, well, why is there this silence? And the person said, well, don't quote my name, but actually they don't have an answer. And I think that's the case. There is no answer to the question of genetic entropy. It is clearly evident that, like everything else in this universe, life is getting more and more corrupt, getting more and more disorganized. Why would you expect it to be anything but that? He noticed that in confirmation of this came, in funnily enough, with a variant of the Spanish flu, which over the years, which is quite topical considering we have COVID-19 at the moment, over the years that there has been greater and greater mutations going on until eventually it collapsed as a viable organism, because at about 2,000 mutations, it simply wasn't viable anymore. And that's what will happen to COVID-19. It will effectively mutate and mutate and mutate to become less and less viable. These mutations are not conferring much in the way of survivability, other than for the short term. They ultimately will degrade the organism. Interestingly, if we look at the issue of mutations, which we know do happen, the work of Nathaniel Jensen quite recently looked at the mitochondrial DNA differences. And mitochondrial DNA is interesting because it's only inherited by the female side, and therefore we can use it reasonably objectively to try and work out how old an organism is. Most other mutations are quite difficult to differentiate because you've got the male and female joining together. So, looking at mitochondrial DNA, where we have done it for 4 particular creatures, there's an interesting observation. Let's take the issue of humans. With DNA changes that we'd expect, mutations, for humans, if we take humans as being around for 180,000 years, at the rate of mutations that we observe now, we would expect to see around about 200 mutations. If, however, they'd only been around for around 10,000 years, we would expect around about 10 mutations. What do we actually observe? About 10 mutations. Nowhere near the 200 you'd expect from 180,000 years. If we look at fruit flies, where the expectations they've been around for 20 million years by the conventional chronology, we would expect to find around about 500,000 mutations. What would we expect if they've been around for 10,000 years? We'd expect to see around about 500 mutations. What do we actually find? We find about 1,100 mutations. Much, much closer to the 10,000 years. Let's look at roundworms. If roundworms is 18 million years in the conventional chronology, what would you expect to find in terms of mutations over that period? You'd find a phenomenal 2 million mutations. What do you get from 10,000 years? You get around about 1,500 mutations. What do we actually see? 1,600 mutations. Again, almost exactly what we'd expect. Let's look at water fleas. Supposedly been around for 7.5 million years. How many mutations would we expect? 130,000 mutations. What do we expect after 10,000 years? Around about 200 mutations. What do we observe? About 600. Again, in all 4 cases, we see that the rates of mutations accurately fit what we'd expect from a recent creation. So we see here evidence in biology for design, for genetic entropy, and for the mutation rate where we can observe it objectively to be consistent with a recent creation. I consider these things to be overwhelming evidence that we live in a world that has been created and designed, and that supports the biblical picture that the Bible is an accurate revelation from God. And I hope in my next talk to consider possibly one of the most difficult areas to consider on this one, because we know so little and therefore it's quite difficult to get to grips with that one, and that's the issue of cosmology. So thank you for listening, and as I said, my next talk will be on cosmology.